and he saw an ambush being set up by the Viet Cong, and he saw them getting ready to fire on his patrol, and he yelled back to warn them.
For decades, Chuck Norris wasn't just an actor. He was a symbol of something larger. He embodied discipline, respect, and honor, a quiet force who never needed to prove his strength because his composure spoke for him. In an industry known for inflated egos and fragile tempers, Norris stood apart. He was calm, deliberate, and patient, the kind of man who treated a movie set like a sacred dojo where every move, every word carried intention. So when word spread that Norris had once clashed with a younger, unpredictable Hollywood star, fans were stunned. Chuck Norris, the man of restraint, had found someone he could not respect. That someone was Shia LaBeouf. It all began in the late 2000s, when fate brought two very different worlds together for what was supposed to be a small but exciting collaboration, a commercial project that paired the stoic legend of martial arts cinema with the energetic rebel of a new generation. On paper, it sounded perfect, the discipline of the old guard meeting the raw passion of the new. But when filming began, the contrast between the two wasn't cinematic. It was combustible. Chuck arrived early, as always, every line memorized, every motion precise. He was polite to the crew, professional to the last detail. He radiated calm authority, the kind that didn't demand respect. It inspired it. Then Shia walked in, bringing chaos in his wake. He was loud, animated, and brimming with a restless energy that seemed to fill the entire room. He didn't just follow the script. He tore it apart. He improvised long monologues, demanded retakes even when the director was satisfied, and insisted the story needed more truth. To Shia, art was born in rebellion. To Chuck, it was born in control. At first, Norris tried to see the best in him. He had worked with all kinds of actors, from rookies to icons, and he believed discipline could be taught through example. But as the days went on, it became clear that Shia wasn't looking to learn. The young actor treated every scene like his own personal experiment, ignoring structure, timing, and teamwork. The crew grew tense, the director frustrated, and Norris, ever the master of composure, grew silent. He didn't argue, didn't scold. Instead, he observed quietly, the way a teacher watches a student lose balance over and over, knowing the fall is inevitable. His silence wasn't surrender, it was judgment. NBY, the third day of shooting, the atmosphere on set had changed. People whispered between takes. The energy was fractured. Norris remained calm but distant, speaking only when necessary, performing his scenes with precision before walking off set. The two men rarely exchanged words. To Shia, Norris's quiet seemed old-fashioned, maybe even passive. But to those who understood Chuck, his silence was the loudest response possible. When filming wrapped, there was no handshake, no farewell, no acknowledgement that two worlds had even crossed. It was over before it began, a meeting of opposites that left nothing but tension in its wake. Years later, in 2020, Chuck Norris broke that silence, but not with a confrontation. He posted a single line on Facebook: "Fame without discipline is chaos." No names, no explanations. But the message was clear, and Hollywood understood exactly who it was aimed at. It wasn't just a criticism, it was a warning. For Norris, fame without respect for one's craft wasn't success. It was self-destruction waiting to happen. And to those who knew the story, that one sentence carried the weight of an entire philosophy. NTHE moment passed, but the message endured. Shia continued his unpredictable journey, winning praise and controversy in equal measure, while Norris retreated into the quiet dignity he'd always valued. They never worked together again, never spoke of the incident publicly, and perhaps never needed to. In the end, it wasn't a feud, it was a reflection of two opposing forces that could never coexist. Chuck Norris represented mastery through restraint, the belief that discipline was the highest form of freedom. Shia LaBeouf represented raw, unfiltered chaos, the belief that art lived only in defiance. Their collision was brief but explosive, a clash of worlds where silence spoke louder than argument. And as the dust settled, one truth remained unshaken. In Chuck Norris's world, chaos had no place. When Chuck Norris spoke, people listened, not because he shouted, but because he didn't need to. His words carried weight, forged from decades of quiet strength, military precision, and martial arts mastery. So when he once dismissed another martial artist as a wannabe who will never be, the world paid attention. Those words weren't random. They were aimed at a man whose arrogance had tested the patience of nearly every legend in Hollywood's fighting circle, Steven Seagal. What made this clash so shocking wasn't just that both men were icons of action cinema. It was that one of them lived by honor and the other by ego. When Seagal arrived in Hollywood in the late 1980s, he was unlike anyone else. He carried himself like a mystic warrior, smooth, silent, and impossibly confident. His debut films, like Above the Law and Hard to Kill, made audiences believe he was the real deal. He wasn't just playing a martial artist, he was one. Or at least, that's how he wanted the world to see him. He boasted of being the first Westerner to run a dojo in Japan, a claim that added to his allure. For a while, even seasoned fighters watched with curiosity, wondering if a new kind of martial arts star had arrived. But fame has a way of magnifying the truth. And behind Seagal's serene demeanor, there was something else: pride. It started subtly in interviews and talk shows. Seagal began downplaying other martial artists, including Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris. He suggested that their movies were more choreography than combat, more showmanship than skill. For Norris, a man who had spent his life bridging real martial arts with film, this was more than an insult. It was an act of disrespect toward a sacred art form. He had trained under masters, competed in real tournaments, and earned his titles the hard way. To hear a fellow martial artist mock that discipline for publicity struck him as dishonorable. The martial arts world buzzed with disbelief. No one criticized Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris and walked away unscathed, not physically, but in reputation. NTHE response came not through fists, but through brotherhood. Bob Wall, one of Bruce Lee's closest friends and Norris's longtime ally, publicly challenged Seagal, daring him to step into the ring and prove his words. Legends like Bill Superfoot Wallace and Benny the Jet Urquidez, names that commanded respect across continents, stood beside Wall. The message was clear. If Seagal truly believed he was superior, he could show it. But Seagal stayed silent. In martial arts, silence can mean wisdom or weakness. In this case, everyone knew which one it was. The man who had boasted about unbeatable skill refused to fight those who lived and breathed real combat. And Chuck Norris never joined the public call-out. He didn't need to. He wasn't interested in spectacle. Instead, when asked about Seagal years later, he gave a measured but devastating reply: "A wannabe will never be." That single line carried more force than any roundhouse kick. It was the verbal equivalent of a knockout. Controlled, efficient, and final. With that, Norris drew a line in the sand. To him, martial arts wasn't about fame or ego. It was about respect, humility, and truth. Seagal had broken that code, and in Norris's world, there was no redemption once honor was lost. As time went on, the gap between them only widened. Norris continued to command universal respect, his reputation untouched by scandal or arrogance. Seagal's, on the other hand, began to crumble. Reports of erratic behavior, inflated claims, and behind-the-scenes controversies followed him wherever he went. What had once seemed mysterious now looked hollow, a persona built on talk rather than substance. In contrast, Norris remained the embodiment of quiet authenticity, the master who never needed to prove himself because his legacy already had. NTHE irony was almost poetic. Steven Seagal had tried to elevate himself by tearing others down, but in doing so, he only revealed the emptiness beneath his bravado. Chuck Norris didn't have to fight him to win. His silence, his grace, and his unwavering dignity did that for him. In the end, their feud wasn't just about two men. It was about two philosophies. Seagal chased glory through arrogance. Norris earned greatness through humility. And history has a long memory for which one endures. Today, Seagal's name sparks debate, controversy, and disbelief. Chuck Norris's name, meanwhile, remains synonymous with strength, integrity, and timeless respect. Their paths may have crossed only in words, but those words drew a permanent line between legend and imitation. Norris never needed to prove that he was real. The world already knew. Seagal, on the other hand, kept trying to convince everyone, and in that endless struggle his credibility disappeared. The wannabe who will never be had written his own ending, and Chuck Norris never had to lift a finger to make it true. In the early 1980s, Los Angeles was a city that ran on dreams. Every waiter, every bartender, every struggling soul behind a bar counter had a screenplay in their back pocket, or a head full of fight scenes they swore would one day make it to the big screen. Among them was a young, ambitious Belgian named Jean-Claude Van Damme, a man with the physique of a statue and the hunger of a wolf. He worked odd jobs, slept in cheap motels, and spent his nights shadowboxing under flickering streetlights. One of those odd jobs brought him to a place called Woody's Wharf, a buzzing bar co-owned by a living legend, Chuck Norris. Fate, it seemed, was about to give the young fighter the mentor he'd always dreamed of. When Van Damme met Norris, it was like a disciple meeting a monk from a higher temple. Norris had already achieved what every martial artist in Hollywood dreamed of: success without scandal, fame without arrogance. He was the man who had turned discipline into stardom. To Van Damme, he was proof that martial arts could become art. Norris, in turn, saw potential in the eager young Belgian, raw, unpolished, but promising. For a time, their connection resembled that of teacher and student. Norris offered guidance, advice, and quiet encouragement. Van Damme soaked it all in. For him, this wasn't just mentorship, it was destiny unfolding. And for a few short years, it seemed that destiny was smiling. And then came Bloodsport and Kickboxer, and everything changed. Overnight, Jean-Claude Van Damme transformed from a struggling dreamer into an international action star. His perfect kicks, his charisma, and his accent, all of it made him unforgettable. But with fame came something else: ego. The humble protege, who once bowed to his master's wisdom, began to see himself as an equal, maybe even a rival. On movie sets, stories began to surface. Van Damme showing up hours late, demanding script rewrites, arguing with directors, and refusing to take direction. What he once viewed as discipline, he now saw as limitation. The fire that had once driven him began to burn uncontrolled. And Chuck Norris, watching from afar, felt a slow sadness replace his early pride. Hollywood insiders whispered about a potential collaboration, a film that could have united the two titans. It was rumored to be called The Eagle Shadow, a martial arts thriller that would pit master against student, echoing Norris's legendary duel with Bruce Lee in The Way of the Dragon. Fans were ecstatic. It had the makings of another cinematic milestone. But as negotiations began, Van Damme's erratic behavior and constant demands reportedly derailed everything. The project faded into rumor, and so did any chance of rekindling the respect between them. Norris, ever the gentleman, remained silent. He didn't attack, didn't complain. He simply moved on. Silence for him had always been the highest form of judgment. Years later, at a martial arts expo, someone asked Chuck Norris what he thought of Van Damme. The audience waited for gossip, maybe even a soft compliment about the younger star's success. But Norris gave only one word: undisciplined. The crowd went quiet. To most, it was a mild remark. To those who understood Norris, it was devastating. In his world, being called undisciplined wasn't criticism, it was exile. It meant you had broken the code, the sacred rule that mastery begins and ends with self-control. That single word ended what had once been a relationship of admiration and promise. NFOR Van Damme. The years that followed were a storm. His fame peaked, then wavered. His personal life unraveled amid stories of excess and addiction. Eventually, he admitted publicly that success had changed him, that the hunger to prove himself had turned into arrogance. In interviews, he spoke of regret, humility, and lessons learned. But by then, the damage was done. The mentor who might have guided him through the chaos had long since closed that chapter of his life. For Chuck Norris, the story wasn't about revenge or resentment. It was about the tragedy of potential loss to pride. He had seen it before: students who mistook confidence for mastery, fame for fulfillment. To him, Van Damme's journey was proof of what happens when discipline fades and ego takes its place. The two men never publicly reconciled, but in some quiet way, they will always be connected. The teacher who valued control above all, and the student who learned too late that without discipline, strength is nothing more than noise. And so, the story of Chuck Norris and Jean-Claude Van Damme stands as both inspiration and warning, the rise of a protege, the fall of a friendship, and the eternal reminder that the truest test of a warrior is not how hard he can strike, but how well he can master. In Hollywood, fame often hides the deeper battle lines, not between heroes and villains, but between values. Behind the glamour and red carpets, the industry has always been divided between those who see fame as a platform for change and those who see it as a privilege to be handled with humility. For decades, Chuck Norris stood firmly in the latter camp. He believed fame should inspire, not provoke, uplift, not divide. He used his platform to promote discipline, faith, patriotism, and moral strength. That's why, when Alec Baldwin, one of Hollywood's loudest and most outspoken figures, began using his celebrity to ridicule those very beliefs, Norris couldn't stay silent forever. Though the two men never met face to face, their clash became one of ideology, not ego. A battle of worlds as different as fire and stone. Nalec Baldwin was Hollywood's golden provocateur, a man whose wit and biting satire made him both adored and despised. He had charisma, talent, and a reputation for speaking his mind without filter. When Baldwin began impersonating Donald Trump on Saturday Night Live, the skits quickly went viral. They were funny, sharp, and unapologetically political, everything late-night television thrives on. But for millions of Americans, including Norris, they weren't comedy. They were contempt. Norris wasn't just a conservative. He was a symbol of traditional American values, a decorated Air Force veteran, a devout Christian, and a man who viewed patriotism as sacred. To him, mocking the president wasn't merely political satire. It was mockery of the office itself, of the ideals and faith the country was built upon. NTHE tension grew not through direct confrontation, but through the media. Every week, Baldwin's performances became more outrageous, and every week, Norris's silence grew heavier. Then came 2018, a year of cultural chaos. Hollywood was louder, angrier, and more divided than ever. In the midst of it, Norris penned a column that subtly but unmistakably addressed the issue. Without naming Baldwin, he wrote, "It's easy to tear down what others build when you've forgotten what it means to stand for something greater than yourself." The words hit hard. Fans and reporters immediately connected the dots. Norris, who rarely commented on Hollywood drama, had just taken a moral stand, not against a man, but against a mindset. And Baldwin, known for his quick temper and Twitter tirades, reportedly brushed off the implied criticism. But the public saw what was really happening: the quiet man of principle versus the loud man of provocation. It wasn't about politics anymore. It was about the soul of American entertainment. Norris represented an era where heroes fought for honor, where action stars carried messages of strength and integrity. Baldwin represented the new Hollywood, bold, cynical, irreverent, and unafraid to challenge the old guard. To some, he was brave. To others, he was disrespectful. To Norris, he was simply lost. In a later interview, Norris elaborated on his disappointment with modern Hollywood. He said, "We used to tell stories that inspired people to be better. Now we mock everything sacred." Again, no names, but everyone knew who he meant. His frustration wasn't personal, it was philosophical. Hollywood had become a stage where laughter came at the expense of dignity, where the line between comedy and cruelty blurred. Baldwin's performances had become the symbol of that transformation, the kind that traded respect for ratings. And yet, even in disagreement, Norris never showed hate. That was his strength. He believed in conviction without contempt. His criticism came wrapped in wisdom, not anger. He didn't attack Baldwin's talent. He lamented his choices. Because for Norris, the measure of a man wasn't how loudly he spoke his truth, but how much respect he showed while doing it. Their feud, if one could call it that, became a reflection of something larger, a cultural divide between two Americas, one rooted in faith, discipline, and quiet strength, the other in expression, satire, and outspoken rebellion. In a strange way, Baldwin and Norris became unwilling symbols of both sides, their contrast as vivid as night and day. In the end, Chuck Norris never needed to respond again. His silence, as always, said enough. He had built a legacy on values that couldn't be mocked out of existence. While Baldwin's name became synonymous with controversy, Norris's became timeless, a reminder of what happens when faith, respect, and honor refuse to bow to noise. Their clash was not a war of words, but a mirror held up to a divided culture. And in that reflection, Chuck Norris once again stood as the immovable pillar he had always been. In the world of martial arts cinema, few moments are as unforgettable as the epic showdown between Bruce Lee and Chuck Norris in The Way of the Dragon, 1972. Two warriors, two philosophies, one iconic duel that defined an entire generation of action films. On screen, it was a breathtaking ballet of precision and power, but off-screen, it would cast a shadow that followed both men for the rest of their lives. What began as a friendship built on mutual respect and admiration slowly transformed, in the public eye, into a rivalry neither man had ever wanted. For Chuck Norris, it was a bitter irony that one of his most treasured friendships became the most misunderstood chapter of his life. Truth was far from what the tabloids imagined. Chuck Norris and Bruce Lee first met years before their cinematic clash. At the time, Norris was already a respected martial artist, a karate champion, disciplined and humble. Bruce Lee, meanwhile, was rising fast as both a movie star and a revolutionary thinker in martial arts. The two instantly clicked. They trained together, sparred together, and shared a deep respect for each other's craft. Bruce admired Chuck's technical precision. Chuck admired Bruce's speed and philosophy. They weren't rivals. They were students of the same truth, both chasing perfection through discipline and passion. When Bruce invited Norris to appear in The Way of the Dragon, it wasn't about competition. It was about celebration. He wanted to showcase real martial arts on screen, not just staged fights. Chuck agreed, not because he wanted fame, but because he wanted to honor the art form. The fight they choreographed in the Roman Colosseum wasn't just action, it was storytelling without words. Two men pushing each other to the limits, not out of hatred, but respect. Bruce even insisted that Chuck's character be portrayed as honorable, strong, focused, and brave, even in defeat. When filming wrapped, both men hugged, smiling like old friends who had created something timeless. NBUT Hollywood has a way of twisting truth into myth. When the film exploded in popularity, fans couldn't stop asking the same question. Who would win in a real fight? Everywhere Norris went, interviewers brought it up. They didn't care about his own championships, his military service, or his success. They only wanted to talk about Bruce. Some claimed Bruce Lee's Jeet Kune Do was unbeatable. Others argued Norris's karate discipline would triumph. What had been a friendship soon became a never-ending debate, one that frustrated Norris deeply. People always asked if Bruce could beat me. He once sighed in an interview. They never asked about what we learned from each other. Comparisons grew heavier after Bruce's sudden death in 1973. Fans and journalists immortalized their fight as symbolic, a battle between East and West, philosophy and discipline, style and strength. Norris was heartbroken by Bruce's passing, but even his grief was overshadowed by the rivalry narrative. No matter how many times he praised Bruce as one of the greatest martial artists who ever lived, the media clung to the myth. To them, Bruce and Chuck weren't friends. They were eternal opponents. In truth, Norris never saw Bruce as a rival. He saw him as a brother in arms, someone who shared his commitment to mastery. But what wounded Norris most wasn't the comparisons. It was how the world turned something pure into a contest. For a man who valued respect above all else, watching a friendship become tabloid fuel was disheartening. Over the years, he continued to defend Bruce's legacy, calling him a, quote, trailblazer and a visionary who changed martial arts forever. Yet even those words couldn't silence the endless debates. Fans preferred the fantasy. Two icons forever, locked in a mythical struggle. As time passed, Norris learned to accept it. He understood that legends often live longer as myths than as men. Still, whenever he spoke of Bruce, there was a quiet sadness in his voice, a sense that something sacred had been lost to fame. Their bond, once built on mutual respect, had been hijacked by an audience hungry for rivalry. To this day, the fight scene remains one of cinema's greatest moments. But behind the spectacle lies a truth few ever see. It was never about who would win, but about two masters expressing their shared love for an art that demanded everything from them. In the end, the friendship between Chuck Norris and Bruce Lee wasn't destroyed by hatred, but by legend. And while the world continues to debate who the better fighter was, Norris's answer has never changed. There was no competition. Bruce was my friend, and that was enough. Not all of Chuck Norris's conflicts were born on movie sets or during sparring sessions. Some battles were fought from a distance, not with fists, but with beliefs. And perhaps none cut as deep or lasted as long as his ideological war with filmmaker Michael Moore. This wasn't a feud about fame or ego. It was about the soul of America. On one side stood Chuck Norris, a symbol of faith, patriotism, and personal responsibility. On the other stood Michael Moore, a provocateur who used documentaries to challenge authority, capitalism, and the very values Norris held sacred. Their clash was inevitable, a collision between two men who both loved their country, but saw it through entirely different eyes. NFOR Norris. America wasn't just home, it was a code of honor. He had lived the American dream, from a poor upbringing to military service to global stardom. His success, he believed, came from discipline, faith, and freedom. And above all, he believed those freedoms were protected by good people, police officers, soldiers, and citizens who stood ready to defend their country. Guns, to Norris, weren't symbols of violence, they were tools of protection, symbols of the right to self-reliance. So when Michael Moore released Bowling for Columbine in 2002, a searing documentary that portrayed America's gun culture as dangerous and reckless, Norris saw more than just a film. He saw an attack on the values he cherished most. Norris' film won Oscars, sparked debates, and divided a nation. To many, he was a truth-teller exposing uncomfortable realities. But to Norris, he was a man using shock and shame to tear apart American unity. In interviews and columns, Norris began to speak out, not mentioning Moore by name, but his meaning was unmistakable. "When you take away guns," Norris once wrote, "you take away freedom." It was his way of drawing a line in the sand. For him, Moore's message wasn't about safety. It was about control. It was, in Norris's view, the opposite of everything he fought for. Their indirect feud deepened after Moore released Fahrenheit 9/11 in 2004, a film criticizing the Bush administration and the War on Terror. To many conservatives, it felt like an insult to soldiers serving overseas, men and women who believed they were defending freedom. Norris, a proud Air Force veteran, took it personally. He wrote passionately about respect for those who serve, about the need to honor sacrifice instead of politicizing it. Without ever naming Moore, Norris condemned what he called Hollywood's war on heroes. It was clear whom he meant. In the quiet, measured tone that had become his signature, Norris expressed what millions of Americans felt, that patriotism was being treated like a punchline. NBUT. What made their conflict so fascinating wasn't the anger, it was the contrast. Michael Moore thrived on confrontation. He challenged CEOs face-to-face, ambushed politicians on camera, and relished controversy. Chuck Norris was the opposite. He rarely raised his voice, choosing instead to write calmly and let his words speak through moral conviction. Moore believed in provoking emotion to force change. Norris believed in discipline to preserve stability. Two men, both passionate, both patriotic, and both utterly unable to understand the other. And as the years passed, their ideological divide only widened. Moore continued to make films critiquing capitalism and conservatism, while Norris became an outspoken voice for traditional American values, endorsing Republican candidates and warning against what he saw as moral decay in Hollywood. Their feud evolved into a symbolic one, a reflection of America's own split. Every time Moore released a new documentary, conservative voices like Norris's would rise in response, defending the principles of faith, freedom, and responsibility. Yet, beneath the surface, there was a strange kind of respect, not for each other's beliefs, but for their conviction. Both men stood firm, unshaken, even when mocked or misunderstood. Neither backed down, and that, in its own way, was admirable. Norris once said, "I don't hate people who disagree with me. I just wish they'd see how much this country gives them and how much it's worth protecting." It was a statement that summed up his worldview, unwavering, patriotic, and deeply personal. NTO this day, the clash between Chuck Norris and Michael Moore remains unresolved. It's not about who was right or wrong. It's about what kind of America each man believes in. Moore, still fights to expose what he sees as injustice. Norris still stands guard over the values he believes built the nation. Two men on opposite sides of the same flag, one questioning its flaws, the other defending its strength. And in that divide lies a truth that neither could deny. Sometimes, the fiercest battles aren't fought with enemies, but with fellow countrymen who love the same land, just in different ways.